I want to discuss buying on margin. Whenever you open a brokerage account, I mentioned in class that you can either open a cash account, a wrap account, or a margin account. And a margin account essentially lets you borrow money, some of the money that you want or need to use to purchase stocks or bonds or other types of investments as well. There is, though, a law that says you can only borrow a certain percentage of the purchase price. And at the moment, that percentage is half or 50%. Sometimes we're going to use the margin itself, and sometimes we're going to use 1 minus the margin. If I use a margin rate of 50%, then the margin rate would be 50%, and 1 minus the margin rate would also be 50%. So you'd never know if I was doing times the margin or times 1 minus the margin. So even though the current margin rate, which is actually set by the Federal Reserve, is 50% for stocks, I'm going to use 60%, just so there's a clear difference between 60% and 1 minus 60% or 40%. So the Federal Reserve sets the margin rates. Whenever the stock market crashed in 1929, margin rates were only 10%. And that represents, again, the amount of equity you have to have in an investment. And the rest of it you can borrow from your broker. So essentially, back in 1929, people had taken highly leveraged positions to buy stocks. They had put up 10% and borrowed 90% from their broker. That creates a really risky position, especially when stock prices drop, which I'll talk about in a little bit. In World War II, because there was a great deal of uncertainty, the Federal Reserve raised margin requirements to 100%, essentially saying you couldn't borrow any money to buy stocks from your broker. You had to put up the entire purchase price. But again, at the moment, it is 50%. So there are actually, oh, and let me add that your brokerage firm can actually increase your margin requirements. They can't decrease them, but they can require that you pay a higher margin than the Federal Reserve level of 50%. And it's 50% for stocks. It is a different rate for other types of investments. But there are two types of margin. There's the initial margin, which is essentially when you buy into a position or take a position in stocks, you have to put up this minimum amount. You can put up all of it if you'd like, but you cannot put up less than this. And I'm going to set that at 60%. There is also something called a maintenance margin. And that is the minimum amount of equity you're allowed to have in your account. So you buy on margin. Prices, though, fluctuate every single day. And your broker and the Federal Reserve has set a minimum amount by which your account cannot fall below. So essentially, when you buy on margin, you're going to borrow some money from your broker. So you're going to owe your broker this amount until you pay it off. If the value of your portfolio declines, your equity is going to decline because the amount you owe your broker will stay fixed. It's just that your account is not allowed to decline so that your equity becomes below a certain percentage. And I'm just going to use 35% as the maintenance margin. So I want to work an example. And I'm going to use Apple in this example. Let's say Apple was trading at $485 and you decided to buy 100 shares. And you want to buy on margin, fully utilizing your margin ability, so you would pay only 60% of the purchase price. So even though the entire position will cost $48,500, you're only going to put up 60% of that. And I didn't crunch my numbers before I started recording. So you have to put up 29,100, but you're going to borrow the remainder or 40% from your broker. So you're going to borrow $19,400. The reason that brokerage firms let you buy on margin is because you now have, like if you only had $30,000, then you wouldn't be able to buy a round lot. Maybe you wouldn't have even bought Apple in the first place. But the fact that they're willing to lend you some money means you can afford to buy Apple. So maybe this is a transaction you wouldn't otherwise do. They're going to earn a commission on that transaction. Plus, you have to pay interest on the amount that you borrow. So the brokerage firm gets return from this in a couple of different ways. So now I want to just talk about why people are interested in buying on margin. First, let's just look at your return if the stock price rose to, let's say, $550. If you had not bought on margin, you'd have a nice return. You would have, or I could say it would be worth $550 now. You paid $485 for it. Let's just assume it didn't pay dividends during the time that you owned it. Divide that by your purchase price of $485. And that's a hefty return of 13.402%. Now another way I could calculate that is instead of doing a per share price, I could just do the total dollar value. So instead of 550, I could do 55,000 because I own 100 shares at 550. I paid, if I hadn't bought it on margin, the entire purchase price of 48,500 over the 48,500. That would still give me a return of 13.402%. The reason I'm working it like that is because it's actually easier to deal with margin calculations by using total dollar values instead of per share values. You can see it doesn't impact your answer, but in my opinion it's just a little bit easier to do them with total dollar values, which is why I just showed you that it gives you the same answer regardless of which way you do it. So now what I want to do is look at the buying on margin return. So you can see why people are interested in buying on margin. Essentially, what we did is in the numerator we calculated our profit, and in the denominator we input our investment in the long position of Apple. I'm going to use the same equation over here in buying on margin, but my profit's going to be a little different and my investment's going to be a lot different. So to figure out my profit, if I bought on margin, the stock itself is worth $55,000. I would have to repay my brokerage loan of $19,400 plus interest. So I'm going to actually put that in parentheses. So because I'd be subtracting the $19,400 and subtracting the interest, I just want to emphasize the interest would actually be decreasing the numerator. And then I've got to also subtract, in determining my profit, how much I contributed. So the $19,400 and the $29,100 together total $48,500. So I'm subtracting the same thing over here on the buying on margin as I did right here in this equation, but I'm also subtracting the interest that I owe on the loan. Here I'm just going to assume the interest is zero, but I would in reality subtract how much I owed my broker for borrowing that money. And then, so essentially this numerator would be a little bit lower than this numerator because of the additional interest that I have to subtract. The big difference is the denominator. It should be the amount I contributed toward purchasing the investment. In the first situation right here, I contributed all of the purchase price. But when I actually bought on margin, I contributed only $29,100. So I've got a numerator that's essentially the same, just deducting extra interest, even though in this example there is none, and a denominator that's quite a bit smaller, and that is going to boost the return a great deal. And assuming I haven't made any math errors, my return goes from 13.4% to 22.34% when I bought on margin. So that's why people are very interested in buying on margin. It's essentially leverage. It's using borrowed funds to purchase an asset, and leverage can boost returns when things go well, but they can also, or it can also create problems when things go poorly, and I will talk about that as well.